My name is Ben Bohr, and I'm on the Sloan Research Papers team. And it's a pleasure of mine to introduce Joe Rosales and Scott Spratt, who will be presenting their paper, Who's Responsible for a Called Strike? We will have a presentation for about 20 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A session of 5 minutes. So please hold your questions until then, and I will be walking around with a microphone to help you ask your question. So with that, please join me in welcoming Joe and Scott.
Well, the point of this is we have a couple of embedded videos here that demonstrate the point. In the first example, we have a pitch from Willie Peralta that is the prototypical framing example that you would expect. It's a pitch that's just off the outside corner of the plate, one that Jonathan Lucroy receives, and makes a subtle movement with this glove back into the zone and gets that extra called strike. That's what we really think framing is all about. But that's not really how it always works. Sometimes pitches that are not in the traditional zone, there we go, are called a strike, and sometimes balls outside the zone are called a strike. So we see here in this second example, we have a pitch from Franklin Morales that actually goes straight across the heart of the plate there. But you'll notice that the catcher was set up outside, and when he badly missed the target there, the umpire is tricked and doesn't actually call that a strike. In the next example, we have a pitch here from Justin De Frautis that comes across the inside corner and cuts back into the plate. You see the batter kind of makes a duke like that, and it kind of makes the impression that it was almost going to hit him. In fact, it becomes a strike, but again, is able to get the ball call because of that action. In the final example here, from Zach Greinke, we have a pitch that actually never comes close to the plate. It goes over the white chalk of the other batter's box, but he still gets a called strike there. And the real point that I think we're trying to make here is that those extra strike calls, it's not just about the catcher. Actually, each pitch involves parties, the pitcher, catcher, batter, and umpire, and all of their actions can influence whether or not a pitch is called a strike. Many of the publicly available catcher framing methodologies are entirely focused on the catcher, or if they do use those other parties, they use them as adjustments to the value given to catchers. And what we set out to do with our new system here is create a framing methodology that actually apportions credit to all of those parties appropriate with the value they're providing. We called that method the strike zone plus minus system. And it's a way to quantify whether a player is drawing those extra strikes or preventing extra ball calls that's unique in a couple of ways. Obviously, the main point is that all four parties that are involved in those pitch calls are accounted for. But in addition, it uses BIS's command charting data. It's something that we uniquely collect at Baseball Info Solutions. We gather information on where the catcher is setting up his target before each pitch. And using that in association with where the pitch becomes located, we can figure out exactly how good the command was. But let's take it from a bit broader level. There are a couple of different variables that we decided that we wanted to account for here. The most significant of which are pitch location, ball strike count, pitch commands, and batter handedness. In addition to that, we also considered looking at pitcher handedness, pitch type, and home road split. But after we had accounted for the original variables, we found that those other three variables had less significance, and we stuck with the original four. Let's take them one by one here. First, with the pitch location, this is really the most obvious. If you're going to throw a pitch into the heart of the zone, that Franklin Morales example omitted from that, it almost always is called a strike. And if you're well off the plate in any direction, that's going to be a ball almost 100% of the time. And you'll see in the graphic that we have here, the red represents pitches that almost always get called strikes, the blue almost always get called balls. However, you'll notice that along the band, along the edges of the strike zone, there's this gray, or in this case yellow area, that represents pitches that are sometimes called strikes and sometimes called balls, and there are various factors here that come into play, such that not all pitches within the real zone are always called strikes, and not all pitches outside of the zone are always called balls. Next up, we looked at the ball and strike count. And this one's, it's fairly intuitive for people that I think that have watched baseball for a time. It's that when the count favors the pitcher, the umpire is more likely to call more balls that benefit the batter to get the count back into balance. And conversely, if the hitter has the advantage, then the umpire is more likely to call strikes. The most extreme example of this, and the one that you're probably most familiar with, is in 3-0 counts. Hitters rarely swing at those pitches, and almost always the umpire is going to call anything near the zone at all a strike. And that exists to lesser degrees in all of the pitcher and hitter-friendly counts. Next up, pitch command. I mentioned a minute ago that BIS collects this data based on the catcher's mitt location prior to each pitch. We focus specifically on the horizontal distance between where the catcher's setting up and where the pitch actually ends up. We found that there was a much stronger significance there than there was at the vertical distance. And so we grouped our pitches based on those into bands. You'll see that the red represent the pitches that are closest to the mitt. These are the ones, the opposite of that Franklin Morales pitch that we showed earlier. And those tend to get extra strike calls because they're hitting the target. The further away that you get, the less likely those pitches are called strikes, even if those pitches are within the traditional strike zone. Finally, we have the batter's handedness. This works the same way for both left and right-handed batters, but it's just mirrored because of their approaches to the plate. Umpires tend to call pitches towards the inner half of the plate. They call those balls more likely than not, and on the outer half of the plate, they're more likely to call extra strikes, given those other variables. All right, I'm going to pass this over to Joe, and he's going to talk you through a specific example of how this methodology works.
Right, so those 4 variables, those are the things that we need to adjust for just to be able to know that once we start calculating the actual credit that we're going to be giving to each player, that we're measuring a true value of their skill and the credit that they deserve. So I'm going to start getting into a little bit of the dirty details then of the calculation itself. What's up here now is just sort of a quick overview. If you're familiar at all with sort of strength of schedule ranking systems, this is somewhat similar. We're basically doing an iterative approach where, with the first iteration, we don't know anything prior to doing it, what the tendencies are of any of the individual players involved. So initially, we're going to start by just sort of saying that each of the pitcher, batter, catcher, and umpire can lay equal claim to whether that pitch ended up being called a ball or a strike. Once we've done that for every pitch, we'll see, when we add up all those credits and debits for every player, we can see that certain players are going to come out with it as a net positive, others net negative, and that'll be able to sort of start to indicate what their personal tendencies are, and essentially inform us to then be able to sort of circle back, make some adjustments on the credit that we're apportioning, and who actually deserves more and less of the credit on a given pitch. So that's how each of the subsequent iterations are going to happen. We're basically, with each iteration, the changes in the credit that we're associating to each player are going to get smaller and smaller until they converge on their true skill level and their true credit that they deserve. And then what we're going to do after we've apportioned all these plus-minus credits, what we want to do is express these in terms of runs, because this is baseball and we want to know how that's affecting the game. So we've also calculated a conversion rate, essentially a run value of converting a pitch from a ball into a strike as 0.12. The other thing, we've been throwing around this term of plus minus, just to sort of give you, make that clear to you. It's essentially if there's a certain likelihood based on those 4 parameters that Scott was talking to you about before of a pitch being called a strike. And basically, if a pitch is called a strike, there's positive credit to be given, the plus, and if the pitch is called a ball, there's negative credit to be given, that's the minus. So essentially, if you think about it, if there's a probability P of a pitch being called a strike, if it's not called a strike, that's negative P strikes lost on the pitch. If the pitch is called a strike, that's positive 1 minus P strikes gained on that pitch. So just to run through a quick example to try to help make this clear for people. If given a sample pitch here of a pitch that's 1 inch off the outside edge of the plate, 10 inches off the ground, in a 2-1 count, that ends up being 6 inches from the catcher's target to a left-handed batter. Based on the metrics that we've got, that pitch is called a strike about 43% of the time. So again, if that pitch ends up being called a ball, would be negative 0.43 strikes lost. But if it's called a strike, it's positive 0.57 strikes gained. So we'll say, for this particular example, we're going to call this pitch a strike. So there's 0.57 points sort of to be attributed now. They're distributed among the 4. Now, for this example, let's say James Shields was pitching to Salvador Perez, Osvaldo Arcia batting, Dana DeMuth behind the plate. Again, like as I was mentioning before, initially we don't know anything about the tendencies of any of these 4. So we're going to sort of just assume that this first iteration, they all can lay equal claim to that 0.57 points of credit. So we're going to give them each positive 0.1425 points of credit. we do that for every single pitch that occurs in our data set, and again, add up all the pluses and minuses for every player and average that across all the pitches that they've been involved in. And that, at the end of the first iteration, is going to sort of tell us what each of at least give us an initial indication of what each of these players' tendencies are. So again, these are totally hypothetical numbers, but let's say at the end of that, James Shields gets about 0.018 plus minus points per pitch. So he's got a fairly significant, ability to get extra strikes called, where, if you look, Salvador Perez might be, about average. Osvaldo Arcia might be also sort of be inclined towards strikes being called while he's at the plate. And then maybe you have Dana DeMuth, who's actually more inclined for those pitches to be called balls. We can use this information now to adjust the credit that we're going to give to each of these four on a given pitch. So now, if we look at the second iteration, what we need to do here is we're going to take that individual contribution of each of those players based on that tendency and sort of take that out of the overall plus minus of the pitch, and and then reapportion the sort of separate that from what can be attributed to the neutral environment that the pitch was thrown in. So essentially, if you add up the individual contributions of all four of these, the 0.018 for Shields, the 0.002 for Perez, the 0.015 for Arcia, and the negative 0.005 for DeMuth, you get about, you get exactly 0.03. And if we subtract that, that's the combined individual contributions of each. If we could subtract that from the total 0.57 of the pitch, you're left with 0.54. That's sort of what's attributable to the neutral environment. And that's the piece that we're going to still sort of say that each of the four have equal claim to, and basically we'll add, we have for each of those four an individual piece and a neutral piece, and you'll see that the new total that we get for each of these four on that given pitch, somebody like Shields, who is more inclined towards getting extra strikes called, instead of that 0.1425 from the equal distribution that we had at the first iteration, now he's getting 0.153 credit, so more of that credit. And somebody like DeMuth, who is more inclined towards those pitches being called balls, he's going to get less of the credit. I mean, this pitch is still called a strike, so everybody's still going to get positive credit, but he's getting much less of it than Shields is. Once you've got these new results, do the same thing again. You're going to get new results in terms of their individual tendencies. We'll run it through again. The results will change again. But as we keep doing these iterations, we keep converging to smaller and smaller changes till we get to the point where we feel very confident that we have accurately apportioned the credit for each of these pitches. Now, one thing that one might question when we're getting into this kind of stuff is, especially with pitchers and catchers, pitchers are throwing a lot of their pitches to the same catcher. So how do we know that we're truly measuring independent skills here for each of the players involved? Basically, how do you know that if you've got a good catcher behind the plate, he's not just making all of his pitchers look good? So we did a couple of with or without you correlation tests that came out pretty favorably for our methodology. Basically, we looked at every pitcher and his strike zone plus minus numbers with an individual catcher that he threw to, and then his strike zone plus minus numbers with all the other catchers, aggregately that he threw to, and ran a correlation of those for every pitcher-catcher duo. And basically, if what we would expect is that a pitcher's numbers are going to be the same whether he's throwing to one catcher or he's throwing to any other catchers. And you can see the R value that we got, a very high correlation, so that does indicate that the pitcher's numbers are consistent across the catchers. Now, if we take those same pairings, we would hope to see that the catchers aren't correlating well, because we want to know, theoretically, their numbers are not going to be affected by whoever's pitching to them. So, again, we did the same thing, same pairings, basically looking at this time the strike zone plus minus numbers of the catcher with that pitcher, and then the aggregated strike zone plus minus numbers of all the other catchers with that same pitcher. And we got a correlation very close to zero, which basically, again, tells us that we're nicely dividing these credits evenly and independently between all of the parties involved. And the Stultz-Hundley example here is just to, I know this is a little bit, could be a little confusing and a little fast, but basically, if you look here, Stultz when throwing to Nick Hundley over the 2010 to 2013 data sample that we used, he had a 0.02 plus minus per pitch rating, which was almost identical to his plus minus per pitch with all other catchers. And when we take the converse of that, Hundley with catching Stultz, his numbers were actually negative, but when we look at all other catchers that were catching Stultz, their numbers were actually positive. So it follows what we're hoping to see. Now we're going to sort of get a little bit into some of the results, but before we do that, we just sort of wanted to talk about like some of the why this matters so much. I mean, this is something that there are certain catchers we know, everybody knows are great. Yadier Molina is a great catcher. He's, it's BIS. We've started the Fielding Bible Awards back in 2006, and since then, Yadi's won 6 of the 9 awards that have been given at catcher. He's won the last 7 Gold Gloves. He's a great catcher. We all know that. But what these numbers are starting to do is shed a little bit of light on other guys that have been underappreciated, like Jonathan Lucroy. And at Baseball Info Solutions, we have 5 different metrics by which we evaluate catcher's defense. If you look at all the way over at the right-hand side, that column basically tells you that the total runs saved over the last 5 years of these 2 catchers, like these are the 2 highest totals that we've got, the 2 best catchers. But you can see, obviously, Molina is great, good to great across the board. He would look good no matter what. Somebody like Lucroy, though, all of his value is essentially tied up in this framing skill, and he's by far the best. He's elite, and with this, we can now sort of better appreciate the value of certain catchers. Without it, Lucroy would look like nothing compared to Molina. Scott's now going to get back into some results from the 2014 season.
Yeah, so Lucroy really demonstrated the importance of this skill over the long term, but even just looking at a single season here, we can see some pretty extreme differences between the positive and negative totals. So we have here the leaderboards and trailer boards for catchers from 2014. Not surprisingly, Lucroy's on that list. He's actually been in the top 5 each of the last 5 years, when it's how far back we've run this data. But guys like Mike Zunino and Hank Conger, they're both adding about 16 runs per season based on our method here, based on their framing value. And conversely, guys like Dioner Navarro and Jared Saltalamacchia, -17, -16. So we're seeing more than a 30-run spread from the best to worst players with this particular skill, which it's hugely significant. On average, 10 runs per season equates to an extra win, so we're seeing about a 3-win gap here. Those are pretty big numbers, but a lot of the traditional methodologies that focus specifically on the catcher actually have even more extreme totals than this. And I think you'll see in the next slide that one way that we're mitigating that is because we're accounting for all of the parties involved, we're not double counting and putting it all on the catcher. For instance, look at the leaders here for the pitchers from last season. Hisashi Iwakuma and Felix Hernandez, they were the 2 best pitchers based on this method. And look, their catcher was actually on the list as well, Mike Zunino. So imagine if their excellence in getting extra strike calls and Zunino's excellence were all getting captured in Zunino's numbers, he would have an even more extreme number here. So I think that's a real benefit that we have, that we're splitting up the credit in that way. On the batter side, it's actually, for batters, it's important to keep in mind that if you're getting extra strikes called as a batter, that's a really bad thing for you. So being a leader in strike zone runs saved is not a positive for guys like Melky Cabrera and James Loney. For the trailers, though, those guys are the ones that are getting away with balls that would traditionally be called strikes a little bit less often. For batters, it's not exactly intuitive what skill it is that they're displaying out there that earns them those extra strikes or extra balls. It could be rapport with umpires. One interesting point here is that Miguel Montero is a very good framer behind the plate as a catcher. It's possible that he has really good relationships with umpires, and that's how he's getting that positive tendency there. And then finally, we're able to evaluate umpires in this method to determine which umpires are the most hitter-friendly and the most pitcher-friendly. So if you're a leader in strike zone run save, that means you're benefiting the pitchers and giving them extra strikes over time. The real example here, one of the leaders last year was Bill Miller, and this is a pretty interesting thing for us because we implemented this whole system and found these results near the end of the 2014 season, and then entering the wild card game, Bill Miller was actually the one doing the AL wild card game, and we actually saw these results kind of put into play. if you don't mind playing a few of these videos for us here. So we have, again, James Shields is the example that we were using. We have a variety of his pitches. This one's a little bit off the outside of the plate. The batter gets rung up. In the second example, another one here from Shields. This one is a little bit outside as well, another strikeout call. Finally, we have one that's a little bit lower here off the plate. You can actually see Coco Crisp has a pretty negative reaction towards being rung up on this pitch, but it happened anyway. And it wasn't all just benefiting the Royals. This is a tendency that Miller shows across all teams and circumstances. You can see Lester goes way up out of the zone, still gets the punch out there. So this, obviously, we're demonstrating a skill that has, a 3-win spread over the course of the year. That has a pretty big impact. But there are a couple different ways that you can think about that. It could be from sort of a game plan tendency. Like if you knew Bill Miller was the umpire of your game, maybe you would want to attack it just off the plate. I think the biggest way that this could impact, though, is with free agent catcher evaluation. Keep in mind that for pitchers and for batters, they're already being accounted for in other statistics, their framing tendencies, like their walk rates and their strikeout rates. For catchers, this is an important skill that hasn't really been captured by any other method. So just thinking about it, if this is something that can earn your team a 1.5 win per season, the current estimation of wins on the open market is in the neighborhood of $7 million a year. We're talking about more than $10 million worth of a skill here that isn't being accounted for potentially on the open market. Except for maybe the best hitting catchers out there. So I think this is potentially a place where we'll see more and more money move towards the elite framing catchers. And if not, this is a place that teams can really take advantage of an inefficiency. All right, thanks everyone so much.
Thank you, guys.
Please let us know what questions you have.
Now that this data is publicly available, do you think there's a chance that umpires will tend to overcorrect now that they know, like, oh, I'm the most hitter-friendly umpire, and try to adjust their ways?
I mean, I think there's a certain pride that umpires take in their own personal games, but they've already been, I think, they're being evaluated by Major League Baseball anyway. So, one would think that, I mean, honestly, if this is something that they react to, great. I mean, we all want a perfect strike zone called, right? So if they do, great. Will they? I don't know. That's kind of, I think, their own sort of personal idea.
Hey, Jesse Smith, Seattle Mariners. Really enjoyed your guys' conclusions, by the way. Looking down that list at the batter skill, strike saved, and this is something that Tango pointed out, if you saw any of what his comments were, you think it's fair to say that batter height is the skill being displayed, and did you guys consider trying to incorporate that in your model?
Yeah, so that's a really good question because as you saw at the top of the list, Dustin Pedroia was the batter that saw the fewest extra strikes, so the largest negative strike zone run saved from last year. So that obviously jumped to our mind as well as potentially being something of impact here. But it's actually not true universally. For instance, Jose Altuve has consistently been getting extra strikes called for him over time. So I think what we're actually seeing there with Pedroia is a real skill, whatever it is that he's doing, that's not about his height specifically.
And then also, the iterative model, really cool. Was that the first model you guys tried, or did you compare that to other things and determine it was more successful?
I mean, it was something that we certainly, we brainstormed a couple of different ideas, but it was definitely the one that quickly gained the most traction and that we, developed, it sort of went down the road of developing because it worked out really well.
Yeah, I was just wondering, did you take into account like the rhythm of the game or, the pitcher, say he's throwing 3 or 4 strikes in a row, whether the umpire is more likely to favor him and, be happy to get the game moving or anything like that?
No, we kept it to just sort of the variables that Scott described, but, at the beginning, those 4 sort of context-related variables. There's a million different things that we could consider. I mean, there was the 3 that we did consider that we didn't incorporate in the model. Then you can talk about reputations, pitchers, whether they, veterans versus rookies, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot that one could theoretically consider here, but we haven't gotten to.
Nathan Bubis, would it be fair to say that the same leaders of other catcher metrics were the leaders in yours, but since you took credit away, you would say that they're less valuable now because of their skill?
So one thing that is actually interesting and that I don't know if we mentioned during this is that the leaders and trailers do oftentimes match, but what is sort of key to the way that our methodology has worked is that the results are actually much more muted than a lot of the other methodologies that are out there. So, there's, I think, been a certain skepticism with catcher framing numbers being as large as they are in some certain metrics, so, like, I think that the way that we've done it here, where we're apportioning that credit and taking some of it away from the catcher, I think makes our numbers come out, I think, a lot more realistically than some of the other methodologies have in the past evaluated players as.
I don't know if there's been any previous research into this before, but do you see these pitch framing effects having an effect on batter tendencies? So if they know that a Jonathan Lucroy is behind the plate, they're more likely to swing at a pitch outside of his zone because they may believe that the call will be a strike anyway. Do you see like a cumulative effect of that and maybe adding that into the value of the catcher?
I think that makes a lot of sense, but it kind of points back to the example with Bill Miller, and that's looking at it more from the umpire perspective as opposed to the pitcher perspective. But you could see in that game that the hitters weren't really prepared for that kind of wide strike zone, even though that's a tendency that could exist. I think we're sort of maybe potentially waiting for this data to get out there more for people to be able to really react to it and prepare for it in that way. But I think that would definitely probably happen down the line.
Okay, so that concludes the time we have for questions. So please, again, thank our presenters.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.